My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 31 years old now, and 13 years ago, my older brother destroyed my entire life with a single lie that everyone believed except me. It happened on October 14th, 2013, in our hometown of Springfield, during a cold Monday night that I still remember down to the smell of rain on the sidewalks outside Mercer Auto Repair, the small garage my father owned for almost 27 years. Back then I was only 18, a senior in high school who spent afternoons helping my dad change brake pads and oil filters while dreaming about getting into engineering school someday. But my brother Nathan had different dreams, and most of them involved shortcuts, gambling, fast cash, and blaming other people whenever things went wrong. Everyone in town loved Nathan because he knew exactly how to perform for people. Teachers called him charismatic, neighbors called him charming. Girls followed him around like he was some local celebrity, and my parents treated him like he could do no wrong even after he wrecked my father's truck drunk at 19 and somehow convinced everyone that the icy road was responsible. I was the opposite. Quiet. Careful. The kind of kid teachers trusted to collect assignments and lock classrooms after debate club meetings. My history teacher, Mr. Lawson, used to joke that I apologized to chairs after bumping into them. But none of that mattered the night the police found $38,000 missing from Mercer Auto Repair and discovered stolen customer checks hidden inside my school backpack. Before I explain how impossible that sounds, you need to understand something about my brother. Nathan never stole small. He stole in ways that made him feel powerful. He owed dangerous people money from sports betting, something I only discovered years later, and by October 2013 those debts had grown so large that he was desperate. 2 days before everything happened, I overheard him arguing with someone outside our garage behind the dumpster near the alley. The man told him, "Friday means Friday," and Nathan looked terrified for the first time in his life. When he noticed me standing there, he immediately smiled and acted casual, asking if I wanted pizza like nothing happened. That was Nathan's greatest talent. He could switch faces instantly. At school the next morning, my best friend Tyler noticed I looked distracted during chemistry class, and when I told him Nathan was acting strange, Tyler laughed and said, "Your brother always acts strange." I wish that had been true. Strange would have been better than dangerous. That Monday evening, my mother asked me to close the garage because my father had left early with chest pain that later turned out to be stress-related. Nathan offered to help me clean up, which shocked me because he almost never stayed late unless he needed money. Around 8:40 p.m., he handed me a soda from the vending machine near the office while I finished paperwork at the front desk. I only drank half before feeling exhausted. My eyes became heavy. My memory blurred. I remember Nathan telling me, "Go home, Danny, I'll lock up." Then everything skipped forward like missing scenes in a movie. I woke up the next morning on the office couch to flashing police lights outside the garage windows and Officer Reynolds grabbing my arm while another officer dumped stolen checks from my backpack onto the desk. My mother was crying hysterically. My father looked pale and furious. Nathan stood beside them with one hand covering his mouth like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he said the sentence that changed my life forever. "Danny, how could you do this to us?" Even now, after 13 years, I can still hear how perfectly he delivered that line. Not too dramatic, not too calm, just enough disappointment to make everyone trust him immediately. I tried explaining that none of it made sense, that somebody planted those checks, that I barely remembered the previous night. But then Officer Reynolds opened the cash drawer records and discovered that my employee code had been used to access the garage safe at 11:13 p.m. According to security footage from a nearby liquor store, someone wearing my gray hoodie left the alley behind the garage carrying a black duffel bag around that same time. The face wasn't visible clearly, but it didn't matter anymore. In a town like Springfield, once suspicion sticks to you, people stop looking for truth. They only look for confirmation. By lunchtime, students at my high school were whispering when I walked through the hallways. One girl literally pulled her purse closer when I sat beside her in economics class. My guidance counselor avoided eye contact entirely. The principal suspended me before charges were even officially filed. And the worst part? Nathan stayed beside me the whole day pretending to support me while secretly watching his own lie destroy my future piece by piece. But here's what nobody knew then. Not even me. My brother had made one mistake that night. One tiny mistake hidden beneath years of manipulation, and 13 years later that mistake would expose everything during the most public moment of his entire life. The next 3 weeks felt less like real life and more like drowning slowly while people stood around debating whether I deserved help or not. Detectives charged me with felony theft, fraud, and possession of stolen financial documents on October 29, 2013, just 11 days before my 18th birthday, and suddenly the entire town treated me like some criminal mastermind instead of a kid who still forgot to separate laundry colors properly. My mugshot appeared on local Facebook groups before the official police report was even finalized, and strangers who had known me since childhood began commenting things like, "Quiet ones are always the worst." Meanwhile, Nathan played the role of devastated older brother perfectly. He told relatives he still believed there was good inside me. He visited me during questioning. He even brought me food once while reporters stood outside the courthouse. Looking back now, I realize he wasn't helping me at all. He was building witnesses who would later swear he seemed heartbroken and supportive. That was Nathan's real intelligence. He never lied carelessly. He built stories layer by layer until even innocent people became part of the deception without realizing it. My father stopped speaking to me except through angry one-sentence conversations about lawyers and ruined reputations. The garage lost customers almost immediately after the story spread. One longtime client named Harold Benson removed all 5 company trucks from our repair contract and told my father he couldn't trust a family business full of thieves. I overheard my dad crying in the kitchen that same night after too many beers while my mother tried calming him down. "Everything I built is collapsing because of him," he said, meaning me. That sentence cut deeper than the charges themselves. Until then, some part of me still believed my parents would eventually realize I was telling the truth. But hearing my father say that made something inside me break permanently. At school, things became even uglier. Tyler was one of the only people who still talked to me normally, though even he admitted the evidence looked terrible. My chemistry teacher, Mrs. Bennett, quietly pulled me aside after class one afternoon and asked if I needed help finding counseling support because she said students sometimes made bad choices under pressure. I appreciated her kindness, but it crushed me that even compassionate people assumed guilt first. The only person who openly questioned the situation was our school janitor, Mr. Ruiz, a quiet older man who had worked there nearly 20 years. One evening, while I cleared out my locker after suspension papers became permanent, he stopped mopping the hallway and said, "Your brother talks too much for an innocent man." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant, but later, those words stayed with me. Nathan constantly inserted himself into every conversation about the case. He volunteered information nobody asked for. He repeated emotional details dramatically. He acted more like a witness preparing an audience than a brother grieving betrayal. Around mid-November, my public defender finally showed me the prosecution's evidence file, and that was when the fear truly hit me. The safe had been opened using my employee code. My fingerprints were found inside the office. Stolen checks were recovered from my bag. Witnesses claimed they saw someone wearing my hoodie near the alley. Even worse, Nathan told investigators he remembered me acting nervous days before the theft, and once overhearing me complain about wanting money for college applications. It was such a believable motive that even I almost admired how carefully he constructed it. The only thing nobody could explain was why exactly $38,000 disappeared while over $12,000 in additional cash remained untouched in the safe. Professional thieves usually take everything. Emotional thieves usually take random amounts. This looked targeted, controlled, intentional. But the detectives ignored that detail because they already believed they had their suspect. Then something happened that made me suspicious for the first time that Nathan had planned more than just the theft itself. 2 nights before my first court hearing, I woke around 2 a.m. and went downstairs for water. Nathan was sitting alone at the kitchen table in darkness holding our father's old revolver. He looked exhausted, sweating heavily despite the cold weather. When he saw me, he immediately shoved the gun into a drawer and snapped, "What are you staring at?" I asked him why he was awake, and after a long silence he muttered, "Sometimes one mistake ruins your entire life." At first I thought he meant me. Now I know he meant himself. The next morning he acted, completely normal again, joking with my mother while making coffee before work. That switch terrified me more than his anger. People who fake emotions occasionally still slip. Nathan never slipped for long. During my hearing, the prosecutor pushed aggressively for adult charges because of the money involved, and I still remember sitting there in borrowed dress clothes while strangers discussed my future like I wasn't even human. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions asking whether I regretted stealing from my own family. One woman from a local news station actually asked if drug addiction motivated the crime. I had never even smoked a cigarette in my life. Tyler drove me home afterward because my parents stayed behind talking to lawyers and insurance investigators. Halfway there, he finally asked the question nobody else dared ask directly. Do you think Nathan could have done it? I wanted to say yes immediately, but fear stopped me. Accusing Nathan without proof sounded desperate, so instead I said, I think Nathan knows more than he's saying. Tyler didn't respond for almost a minute. Then he quietly admitted he'd seen Nathan meeting strange men near the football stadium parking lot several times during senior year. Men much older than him. Men who looked dangerous. That was the first real crack in Nathan's perfect image, and even though I didn't know it yet, that tiny crack would eventually grow large enough to destroy everything he spent 13 years trying to protect. My first court date was scheduled for December 12, 2013, exactly 35 days after the robbery, and by then, my entire future had already started collapsing in ways nobody warned teenagers about when they talked about criminal accusations. Colleges stopped replying to my applications. My acceptance interview with the engineering program at University of Illinois was quietly canceled without explanation. Former friends avoided eye contact whenever I passed them downtown. Even church became unbearable because people would smile sympathetically at my parents while staring at me like I carried some contagious disease. The Mercer family had lived in Springfield for generations, and suddenly our last name became gossip material at grocery stores and diners. My mother barely left the house anymore. My father worked longer hours trying to save the garage from bankruptcy after losing several business contracts because of the scandal. Nathan, meanwhile, became the unofficial emotional spokesman of the family. He handled calls from relatives. He spoke to neighbors. He comforted my mother publicly while privately watching me unravel piece by piece. I still remember sitting across from him one night at dinner while he calmly described to my aunt over the phone how heartbreaking it was to watch me throw my life away. He sounded so convincing that for a split second, even I questioned my own memory again. That's the terrifying thing about manipulation when it lasts long enough. You begin doubting your own reality. The breaking point came a week before Christmas when my attorney informed me the district attorney planned to offer a plea deal: admit guilt, avoid prison time, accept probation, permanent felony records, restitution payments, and community service. If I refused and lost at trial, they would seek up to 8 years because the theft involved business fraud and forged financial documents. I was 18 years old, being told to choose between confessing to a crime I didn't commit or risking my entire adult life. That night, I sat alone outside Mercer Auto Repair, watching snow gather on abandoned toolboxes near the garage entrance while wondering if fighting was even worth it anymore. Around midnight, Mr. Lawson, my old history teacher, unexpectedly parked beside the building. He had apparently heard from Tyler where I'd been spending nights because things at home had become unbearable. He sat beside me on the cold curb and handed me coffee before saying something I've never forgotten. Truth matters less than consistency in courtrooms sometimes. That's unfair, but it's reality. Then he asked me directly whether I stole the money. I told him no. He studied my face quietly for several seconds before nodding once. Then don't confess just because you're tired. That conversation probably saved my life because by then I was dangerously close to taking the plea deal just to make the nightmare stop. But things became much worse only 2 days later. On December 20th, detectives discovered partial traces of the missing money had been deposited through a fake account opened under my name at a small regional bank 30 miles outside Springfield. Suddenly, the case against me became overwhelming. My lawyer looked defeated during our meeting. Even Tyler admitted it sounded impossible to explain away. But what terrified me most wasn't the evidence itself. It was Nathan's reaction when the news broke. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He looked relieved, deeply relieved, like a man finally convinced he would escape something forever. That was when I became absolutely certain he framed me. Unfortunately, certainty means nothing without proof. Christmas that year was silent and miserable. My mother cried while opening presents. My father drank too much whiskey and fell asleep before dinner. Nathan pretended everything could still heal with time. Around 11 p.m., he knocked on my bedroom door, carrying 2 beers, and asked if we could talk like brothers. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that phrase. He sat on the edge of my desk and told me accepting the plea deal would be best for everyone. Not best for me, best for everyone. Then he leaned closer and quietly added, "If you fight this, things could get uglier." I asked him what that meant, and for the first time in my life I saw genuine fear behind his confident expression. "Sometimes people should just survive what they can survive," he muttered. That sentence haunted me for years afterward because it sounded less like advice and more like a threat disguised as concern. The next morning I discovered my backpack had been searched during the night. Papers were scattered slightly differently than before, and one notebook containing details about Nathan's suspicious gambling. Conversations had disappeared completely. I confronted him immediately, but he simply smiled and said maybe I was becoming paranoid from stress. Nobody believed me when I told them. By January, the pressure became unbearable. My parents stopped defending me publicly because lawyers advised them to stay neutral. I was forced to move into a tiny basement room owned by Tyler's uncle after neighbors began vandalizing our mailbox with words like thief and criminal son painted in red spray paint. The first night there, I genuinely considered disappearing forever. Not suicide exactly, just leaving, taking a bus somewhere nobody knew my name. Starting over before the trial destroyed whatever remained of my future. But then something happened that changed everything. Tyler arrived carrying an old receipt book he found while helping his father clean storage shelves behind the football stadium concession office. At first it looked meaningless. Random maintenance invoices, food orders, equipment logs. But inside one folder was a signed payment slip dated October 13th, 2013, the day before the robbery, showing Nathan Mercer owed $4,000 to a man named Victor Hale for sports settlement balances. Tyler recognized the name immediately because Victor Hale had a reputation around Springfield for running illegal betting operations connected to violent debt collection. Suddenly, Nathan's panic before the robbery finally made sense. He hadn't stolen from our father for greed alone. He stole because he was cornered. And somewhere beneath all the lies, gambling debts, and fake sympathy, my brother had made one catastrophic mistake that eventually would expose him in the most devastating way imaginable. Once Tyler showed me the receipt connected to Victor Hale, the entire story surrounding the robbery suddenly looked different, but proving it was another matter entirely because evidence pointing toward gambling debts was not the same as evidence proving Nathan framed me. My attorney agreed the receipt helped establish motive, yet he warned me carefully that motive alone rarely changes a criminal case once prosecutors feel confident about physical evidence. Still, for the first time in months, I finally felt something stronger than fear. I felt angry. Real anger. The kind that keeps you awake until sunrise, replaying every fake comforting conversation your brother ever had with you while secretly planning your destruction behind your back. Tyler and I started quietly digging into Nathan's life because at that point I had nothing left to lose anyway. My reputation was already destroyed. My college future was disappearing. Half the town thought I belonged in prison. If Nathan truly framed me, then sitting quietly while he ruined my life would have made me a coward. During January 2014, we discovered things about him that shocked even me despite growing up together. He owed over $20,000 across sports betting circles and underground poker games. He borrowed money from coworkers. He lied constantly about business opportunities and investment schemes. A bartender named Elise from a sports bar near the interstate later admitted Nathan sometimes disappeared into back rooms with men connected to Victor Hale's betting operation. But nobody wanted to testify officially because Victor's reputation scared people. One mechanic from a neighboring garage literally told me, "Your brother got mixed up with dangerous trash, kid. Leave it alone if you value breathing." That sentence stayed in my head for weeks. Meanwhile, my own situation kept worsening. Prosecutors increased pressure before trial by leaking details of the fake bank account to local newspapers, and soon even people who previously doubted my guilt started turning against me completely. Tyler got shoved during lunch by 2 former football players who accused him of defending a thief. Mrs. Bennett, my chemistry teacher, quietly arranged extra tutoring work for me because she suspected I might never return to school formally. Even Mr. Lawson warned me privately that juries often cared more about clean narratives than complicated truths. And Nathan's narrative was perfect. Troubled younger brother, desperate for college money, steals from hardworking father, hides evidence poorly, gets caught. Simple stories win. Complicated stories die. Then February arrived, and with it came the moment that completely shattered whatever remained of my relationship with my family. My father called everyone into the living room after dinner and announced he was taking a second mortgage on the garage to keep the business alive after the scandal. He looked exhausted, older somehow, like the past few months had drained years from him physically. Then he turned toward me and said something I still hear in nightmares sometimes. "If you had just told us you needed help, none of this would have happened." That was it. No anger, no yelling, just disappointment so deep it sounded permanent. I tried defending myself again, but Nathan interrupted softly, telling my father maybe they should focus on healing instead of blame. Even now, I can't explain how infuriating his fake compassion felt. I exploded for the first time in my life. I pointed directly at Nathan and shouted that he stole the money, that he framed me because he owed gamblers, that he drugged my soda and planted evidence while pretending to protect me afterward. My mother burst into tears immediately. My father stood up so violently his chair crashed backward against the wall. Nathan stared at me with wide, hurt eyes like I'd gone insane. Then my father slapped me across the face harder than he ever had in my entire life and screamed, "Enough." The room went silent afterward, except for my mother crying. Nathan slowly stepped forward, pretending to calm everyone down while my cheek burned from the impact. Then he quietly said, "I forgive you, Danny." That sentence destroyed something inside me permanently because I finally understood the truth. Nathan didn't merely want to escape consequences. He wanted admiration. He wanted to be viewed as noble, even while betraying me. That night, I packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags: clothes, old notebooks, my grandfather's watch, and a framed science competition certificate from sophomore year. That was all my life fit into at 18 years old. Tyler picked me up around midnight because staying there another minute felt unbearable. While driving toward his uncle's apartment, he asked what I planned to do next. I stared out the frozen car window for a long time before answering honestly. Survive. My first night officially away from home felt colder than any winter I'd experienced before. Tyler's Uncle Frank was kind enough to let me stay rent-free temporarily, but the basement smelled like dust and old paint, and I remember lying awake on a folding mattress listening to pipes rattle overhead while realizing my family probably wasn't even wondering if I was okay. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed unexpectedly with a text from Nathan. It only contained one sentence: "Take the plea deal before people get hurt." No explanation, no signature. Just that message. I showed Tyler immediately, but by morning, Nathan denied sending it and claimed someone must have spoofed his number. Without proof, nobody believed me again. But here's what Nathan didn't realize at the time. Fear makes careless people sloppy eventually. And 13 years later, during a packed courtroom filled with reporters, prosecutors, and cameras, one forgotten digital detail connected to that threatening text would become the exact thing that destroyed him publicly forever. 3 weeks before my trial was supposed to begin, my attorney called unexpectedly and told me prosecutors suddenly wanted another meeting, which terrified me at first because I assumed they had found even more evidence against me. But when I arrived at the courthouse on March 3, 2014, the atmosphere felt strangely different. The district attorney looked irritated instead of confident, and sitting beside him was a woman from the regional bank connected to the fake account opened under my name. Apparently, an internal audit uncovered something detectives had missed earlier. The account application included a surveillance timestamp proving the person who submitted the paperwork wore a dark baseball cap and sunglasses, but security footage also showed that same person entering the bank using a silver pickup truck registered to a garage rental fleet Nathan occasionally borrowed from our father's business. Suddenly, prosecutors no longer viewed the case as airtight. My attorney immediately pushed for more investigation, and within 48 hours, additional inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. The employee code used to access the garage safe had technically been entered manually, meaning anyone who knew my numbers could have used it. The liquor store footage was too blurry for identification. One detective quietly admitted they rushed the investigation because public pressure surrounding a family betrayal story made solving the case quickly politically convenient. Charges against me were eventually dropped, pending further investigation, but that wording didn't repair anything. It didn't restore my reputation. It didn't erase months of humiliation. It didn't force my parents to apologize for doubting me. And most importantly, it didn't expose Nathan officially because there still wasn't enough evidence to charge him directly. Legally, I was free. Socially, I remained guilty in many people's eyes. Springfield had already decided who I was, and small towns rarely update opinions once gossip hardens into memory. Nathan moved out only days after prosecutors backed away from my case. He claimed he needed space from the tension, but I knew the truth. He was running before investigators looked deeper. My mother begged him to stay while my father seemed emotionally exhausted by the entire situation. Neither of them apologized to me directly. Instead, they acted awkward and overly polite, which somehow hurt worse. It felt like they wanted the nightmare forgotten without ever acknowledging what they allowed to happen. I couldn't live like that anymore. So in June 2014, 6 months after leaving home, I boarded a bus to Chicago with $800, 2 duffel bags, and no real plan beyond survival. I still remember watching Springfield disappear through the bus window while wondering whether I would ever return. The first 2 years in Chicago were brutal in ways motivational stories never describe honestly. I worked overnight warehouse shifts unloading delivery trucks while attending community college classes during the day because my original university acceptance offers had vanished after the scandal. I slept 4 hours most nights, sometimes 3. I skipped meals to save money. During winter 2015, the apartment radiator broke for nearly 2 weeks, and I wore gloves indoors while studying physics textbooks under cheap kitchen lighting. There were moments I genuinely hated my life. But there was also freedom in starting over somewhere nobody knew my name. Nobody whispered when I entered stores. Nobody stared at me like a criminal. For the first time since 18, I could breathe normally again. Around that period, I met Professor Adrian Cole, an engineering instructor at community college who changed my entire future without realizing it initially. He noticed I stayed after classes asking unusually detailed questions and eventually offered me part-time work assisting with lab equipment maintenance. One evening while we repaired damaged circuitry boards, he asked why someone with my grades ended up taking such an indirect academic route. I almost lied automatically, but something about him felt trustworthy, so I told him everything. Not dramatically, just facts. When I finished, he stayed silent for nearly a minute before saying, "Sometimes surviving injustice teaches people discipline others never develop." That sentence stayed with me. Over the next several years, Professor Cole became more than a mentor. He became proof that not every older authority figure would eventually betray me. With his recommendation, I transferred into a respected engineering program in 2017 and eventually specialized in cybersecurity systems and digital forensic infrastructure, ironically, the exact field that later would expose Nathan completely. By 26, I was earning more money than anyone in my family ever had. By 28, I co-founded a security consulting company helping businesses investigate digital fraud cases. The newspapers that once treated me like a criminal would have called it inspiring if they knew, but I kept my past buried carefully. Tyler remained my closest friend through all those years, visiting Chicago whenever possible and constantly updating me about Springfield gossip. According to him, Nathan reinvented himself too. He started working in real estate development, married a woman named Claire from a wealthy local family, and became known publicly as a successful businessman involved in charity events and city council fundraising. Hearing that made me physically sick sometimes. He stole my future, nearly sent me to prison, threatened me, and somehow still built himself into a respected public figure. But here's the thing about people who escape consequences through lies. They rarely stop at one lie. By 2025, Tyler started noticing rumors surrounding Nathan's business deals. Missing funds, manipulated contracts, suspicious property transfers. Then came the phone call that changed everything. On August 11, 2026, Tyler called me around midnight sounding more shocked than I had ever heard him before. Federal investigators had arrested Nathan Mercer for financial fraud, wire manipulation, and laundering money through fake development projects connected to senior housing investments. His trial was going national because several wealthy investors lost millions, but Tyler's final sentence hit harder than all the rest. Danny, one of the prosecutors, contacted me asking about the old garage robbery. 13 years after Nathan framed me, the past he thought he buried forever had finally started clawing its way back to the surface. When Tyler told me federal prosecutors were reopening questions connected to the 2013 garage robbery, I honestly didn't know how to react at first, because for 13 years I had trained myself not to expect justice anymore. Survival became easier once I accepted that some people simply get away with destroying others. But suddenly, Nathan's carefully constructed life was cracking apart publicly, and buried underneath the financial fraud investigation, investigators had started noticing patterns that looked disturbingly familiar. Falsified records, manipulated digital access logs, forged signatures, emotional performance tactics, and carefully selected scapegoats whenever money disappeared. Federal agents eventually discovered two former business associates Nathan blamed during separate investment disputes had nearly faced criminal exposure before evidence later cleared them quietly. That detail immediately caught prosecutors' attention because manipulative criminals rarely change methods completely. They repeat successful behaviors until confidence turns into arrogance. 2 weeks later, I received an official request to meet with investigators in Chicago. Walking into that conference room on August 27, 2026, felt surreal because for the first time in my life, authority figures weren't looking at me like a suspect. They were looking at me like someone who survived one. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Sloan led most of the questioning, and unlike local detectives back in Springfield, she noticed inconsistencies immediately. She asked detailed questions about Nathan's gambling debts, the threatening text message, the fake bank account, and even small emotional details surrounding his behavior after the robbery. At one point, she stopped flipping through documents and quietly asked, "Did your brother ever show signs of enjoying control over people emotionally?" That question chilled me because nobody had ever described Nathan that accurately before. I told her yes, absolutely yes. Nathan loved being admired during moments other people suffered. He wanted to appear compassionate while secretly causing the damage himself. Sloan nodded slowly and said federal investigators uncovered evidence suggesting Nathan manipulated accounting employees similarly during his real estate schemes. He would create financial chaos privately, then publicly position himself as the calm problem solver afterward. Same pattern, bigger scale. Before leaving, Sloan asked if I still had the threatening text Nathan sent in 2014. I almost laughed bitterly because keeping that message for 13 years felt paranoid even to me sometimes. But trauma makes people preserve strange things. I had transferred old phone data across devices repeatedly over the years without deleting anything connected to that period. When forensic analysts examined the message metadata, they discovered something astonishing. The text had originated from a prepaid device purchased 2 days before I received it, but the activation records linked indirectly to a convenience store security camera, where Nathan himself appeared buying the burner phone using a personal credit card accidentally visible during the transaction. One careless moment. One tiny oversight. That was the first concrete piece of evidence directly connecting him to witness intimidation related to my case. And once investigators found that crack, everything started unraveling fast. Federal analysts subpoenaed older financial archives connected to Nathan's fraud trial and uncovered buried transactions showing large, unexplained cash payments made shortly after the 2013 robbery to accounts tied to Victor Hale's betting network. Even more shocking, a retired digital technician reviewing archived police evidence discovered the garage security system logs from 2013 had been partially altered manually before investigators copied them. Guess who had access to those systems occasionally because he helped around the office? Nathan. By October 2026, prosecutors privately informed me they believed Nathan absolutely framed me 13 years earlier, but lacked enough remaining physical evidence for separate prosecution because of time limitations and lost records. However, they intended to introduce the entire pattern during his federal fraud trial to demonstrate habitual deception and obstruction behavior. That meant one thing. The truth was finally going public. News outlets exploded once details leaked. Suddenly, old articles calling me a criminal began resurfacing beside headlines questioning whether Nathan Mercer orchestrated one of Springfield's biggest local scandals himself. Former classmates started messaging me awkward apologies online. One even admitted teachers privately debated my innocence years ago but stayed silent because public opinion looked overwhelming. My mother called me crying for the first time in nearly a decade after seeing the reports. I hadn't heard her voice in over 3 years. She kept repeating, "I didn't know. Danny, I swear I didn't know." I wanted to feel satisfaction hearing her break down emotionally, but mostly I just felt tired. Some wounds heal crooked no matter how much truth arrives later. My father refused to speak initially. According to Tyler, he locked himself inside the garage office for nearly an entire afternoon after investigators contacted him. Then came the final twist nobody expected. Prosecutors discovered Victor Hale himself had quietly become a federal informant years earlier after unrelated racketeering charges. And buried inside archived interview transcripts from 2018 was a statement mentioning a local mechanic's son who stole money to clear gambling debts and pinned it on his kid brother because the younger one looked weak. Victor never named Nathan directly because investigators back then cared about larger criminal operations, not old family thefts. But combined with everything else, the statement became devastating corroboration. Nathan's legal team tried aggressively blocking all references to the 2013 robbery from entering trial evidence, arguing it was prejudicial and unrelated to the current fraud charges, but the judge allowed portions demonstrating behavioral patterns and obstruction tactics. That decision changed everything because now Nathan wasn't merely facing financial crime accusations. He was facing exposure as someone who sacrificed his own brother to save himself. The trial began on January 11, 2027, in a packed federal courtroom filled with reporters, investors, legal analysts, and cameras. Nathan entered wearing an expensive Navy suit, looking older but still polished, still controlled, still performing confidence for the audience. Then he saw me seated behind the prosecution team for the first time in 13 years. And for just 1 second, only 1 second, my brother finally looked afraid. The first week of Nathan's federal trial felt less like a courtroom proceeding and more like watching an entire identity collapse slowly under bright lights while cameras recorded every crack in real time. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps every morning before sunrise because the case had evolved from a standard financial fraud story into something far darker and more emotionally explosive. A respected businessman accused not only of stealing millions from investors, but potentially framing his own younger brother years earlier to protect himself. Legal commentators on television kept calling it a pattern of calculated betrayal, and every time I heard those words, I felt strange hearing the nightmare of my private life transformed into public entertainment. Nathan still tried maintaining his performance during the opening days. He smiled politely at jurors. He whispered confidently with his attorneys. He occasionally glanced toward the audience section where Claire sat looking emotionally exhausted beside Nathan's parents-in-law. But the cracks became visible once prosecutors started introducing old evidence connected to the 2013 robbery. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Sloan moved carefully, almost surgically, building the timeline piece by piece so jurors could see the pattern developing gradually, rather than emotionally. She presented gambling debt records tied to Victor Hale's organization. She introduced the burner phone purchase connected to the threatening text message sent to me in 2014. Then she displayed archived financial transfers showing sudden unexplained payments made by Nathan immediately after the garage robbery. Every time new evidence appeared, Nathan's expression tightened slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for someone who knew him well to recognize panic hiding beneath control. Tyler testified on the 4th day of trial and absolutely destroyed Nathan's carefully polished image. Calmly and clearly, he described Nathan's suspicious meetings near the football stadium years earlier, the receipt connected to gambling debts, and the night I moved into his uncle's basement after being thrown out emotionally by my own family. At one point, Sloan asked Tyler whether I ever seriously considered pleading guilty, despite claiming innocence. Tyler looked directly at the jury before answering quietly, "Daniel stopped believing truth mattered anymore." That sentence changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom instantly. Even reporters stopped typing for a moment. Then came my father's testimony. Honestly, nothing prepared me for seeing him walk toward the witness stand looking so much older than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely gray. His shoulders looked smaller somehow. Defeated. Prosecutors questioned him gently about the robbery, the business losses afterward, and the impact the accusations had on our family. When Sloan asked whether he believed me guilty back then, my father's voice cracked publicly for the first time in my entire life. Yes, he admitted, I believed the wrong son. You could hear people shifting uncomfortably throughout the courtroom. My mother started crying quietly behind him in the gallery. Nathan avoided eye contact entirely. Then prosecutors introduced the most devastating evidence yet. Recovered forensic analysis proving portions of the garage security access logs were manually altered using administrative override commands linked to Nathan's office credentials. A digital forensics expert explained carefully to jurors how someone intentionally manipulated timestamp records to strengthen suspicion against me while hiding secondary access activity. Suddenly, the case stopped being emotional theory and became technical proof. Nathan's lawyers tried attacking the age of the evidence, but the damage was already done. During cross-examination, they attempted painting me as resentful and financially motivated for cooperating with prosecutors. One defense attorney even implied I secretly enjoyed seeing my brother publicly humiliated after years of jealousy. I stayed calm until he asked whether I hated Nathan. That question lingered in the courtroom for several seconds before I answered. No, I said honestly. I think hating him for 13 years would have destroyed my life worse than he already did. Even the defense attorney looked slightly unsettled by that response. But the moment nobody in that courtroom will ever forget happened on the 9th day of trial during Nathan's own testimony. Against legal advice, he insisted on taking the stand because he genuinely believed he could talk his way out of anything. That arrogance finally destroyed him. At first, he performed well, denying fraud intentionally, blaming accounting confusion and bad partnerships. Then Sloan shifted unexpectedly toward the 2013 robbery. Nathan immediately became defensive. He repeated that investigators cleared him years ago and accused prosecutors of exploiting family tragedy emotionally. But Sloan stayed patient. Then she displayed the burner phone activation image showing Nathan purchasing the device connected to the threatening text message sent to me in 2014. Nathan froze, completely froze. Sloan asked whether he denied purchasing the phone. Nathan tried claiming he bought prepaid devices regularly for temporary business calls. Then Sloan introduced store timestamp data proving the burner phone activated less than 20 minutes after purchase and contacted only one number. Mine. The courtroom went dead silent. Nathan's breathing visibly changed. His attorney whispered urgently beside him. Sloan stepped closer and asked the question that ended everything. Mr. Mercer, if your brother truly stole that money, why threaten him into accepting a plea deal? Nathan opened his mouth twice before speaking. Nothing came out. Then suddenly, after 13 years of lies, manipulation, and performance, my brother lost control publicly for the first time in his life. He slammed his hand against the witness stand and shouted, "Because he would have ruined everything." The silence afterward felt unreal. Sloan didn't interrupt him. Nobody did. Nathan kept talking, almost like years of pressure exploded at once. He admitted owing dangerous people money. He admitted taking cash from the garage. He admitted planting evidence because he panicked. Then he looked directly at me across the courtroom with tears forming and said something I'll never forget as long as I live. You were always supposed to recover, Danny. You were the strong one. The jury stared at him in complete shock. My mother collapsed into tears. Claire covered her mouth like she couldn't breathe. And in that moment, 13 years after my brother destroyed my life with one lie, the truth finally came out in the most public way imaginable. After Nathan confessed in open court, the entire room descended into chaos so quickly that the judge actually threatened to clear the gallery twice while reporters rushed out into the hallway trying to be the first to break the story nationally. I just sat there frozen, staring at my brother while federal marshals moved closer around the witness stand because Nathan suddenly looked less like the confident manipulator I had feared for years, and more like a man collapsing under the weight of his own lies in real time. What shocked me most wasn't the confession itself. Deep down, I had waited 13 years to hear the truth spoken aloud. What shocked me was how small Nathan looked afterward. For most of my life, he had seemed untouchable, larger than everyone around him because he controlled emotions so easily. But once the performance finally cracked, there was almost nothing underneath except fear and exhaustion. The trial technically continued another 4 days because prosecutors still had to finish presenting financial fraud evidence tied to the real estate schemes. But honestly, the case was already over. Nathan's confession destroyed whatever credibility remained. National news channels replayed courtroom sketches and witness summaries nonstop. Old articles accusing me resurfaced beside new headlines calling me the brother who survived a 13-year lie. Former classmates, old neighbors, even teachers I hadn't heard from in over a decade started sending apology messages online. Some sounded sincere, others sounded guilty. Neither mattered much anymore. The damage had already shaped my entire adult life. 3 weeks later, the jury convicted Nathan on multiple federal fraud charges, obstruction, witness intimidation, and financial conspiracy counts. The sentencing hearing took place on March 3, 2027, exactly 13 years to the week after prosecutors first reopened questions about the garage robbery. Nathan received 22 years in federal prison without parole eligibility for a significant portion because the judge described his actions as a sustained pattern of manipulation causing catastrophic emotional and financial harm to multiple victims, including his own family. Before deputies escorted him away, the judge allowed final statements from affected parties. I hadn't originally planned to speak because part of me wanted distance from the entire nightmare forever. But that morning, Professor Cole called unexpectedly and said something important. Closure isn't about revenge, he told me. It's about refusing to carry someone else's guilt any longer. So I stood up and walked toward the podium while the entire courtroom watched. Nathan avoided looking at me initially. My parents sat together silently in the front row, looking emotionally destroyed. Claire had already filed for divorce by then and wasn't present. I kept my statement simple because dramatic speeches never interested me the way truth did. I told the court that losing 13 years of trust changes a person permanently. I talked about watching my father believe another son over me. I talked about sleeping in a freezing basement at 18 while wondering whether life would ever feel normal again. I talked about how false accusations don't end when charges disappear because suspicion lingers inside people long after facts change. Then I looked directly at Nathan and said the one thing I had understood only recently. You didn't ruin my life by framing me. You ruined your own by choosing cowardice every single day afterward. Nathan finally looked at me then, and for the first time since we were children, I saw absolutely no manipulation in his expression. Only regret. Real regret. But some realizations arrived too late to repair anything. After sentencing, my mother tried hugging me outside the courthouse while crying uncontrollably, and although I let her hold me briefly, I also told her honestly that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. She nodded because I think part of her already knew that. My father struggled more than anyone afterward. Tyler later told me he spent weeks sitting alone inside Mercer Auto Repair staring at old family photographs. Eventually, several months later, he drove to Chicago and asked if we could have dinner together. That conversation was harder than the trial itself because guilt aged him terribly. At one point, he admitted the worst part wasn't believing I stole the money. The worst part was how easily he stopped listening once someone else offered a simpler explanation. We're rebuilding slowly now, but rebuilding isn't the same as restoring. Some cracks never disappear completely. As for me, life moved forward in ways 18-year-old Daniel never could have imagined while sleeping on that folding mattress in Tyler's uncle's basement. My company expanded nationally after the trial because businesses suddenly wanted the cybersecurity expert who survived one of the country's most public framing cases. Professor Cole eventually became godfather to my daughter last year. Tyler still calls every Sunday without fail, and sometimes, usually late at night when the city gets quiet, I think back to that terrified teenager sitting in a courtroom while everyone believed the wrong story about him. If I could speak to him now, I wouldn't promise justice because real life doesn't always deliver justice neatly. Instead, I'd tell him something more honest. Survival itself becomes victory when people expect your destruction. Nathan spent 13 years believing he buried the truth permanently beneath lies, fear, and reputation, but truth is patient in ways guilt never is. Eventually, it waits long enough for people to expose themselves. And when they finally do, the fall is always harder because they built the height themselves. So if you're watching this and you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, or abandoned by people who should have defended you, I want you to remember something important. Other people deciding who you are does not make them correct. Sometimes the only thing you can do is survive long enough for reality to catch up. And trust me, eventually it usually does.